Comrades, a few weeks ago, Israeli columnist Amira Haas wrote a column in the Israeli daily paper Haaretz in which she asked, quote, "What enables the majority of Jewish Israelis to support this systematic and mass erasure of the people of Gaza? What enables the majority of Jewish Israelis to remain unshocked by the fact that in about 2 months we've killed around 7,000 children with the help of America's improved bombs?" End of quote. To answer that question, we have to go back to the early history of Zionism, which in its earliest origins created a system of European Jewish supremacy and sowed deep divisions in the working class of Palestine and in essence labeled the Palestinians as others. I'm going to discuss the history of Zionism, and especially what was called labor Zionism, through a socialist lens. This history not only laid the roots for Israel today, it also holds the lessons for present-day movements elsewhere, including the issue of identity politics. We will also see how global events played themselves out in Palestine. That includes global revolution, the Russian Revolution, and counter-revolution, the rise of the Nazis. Now, by the end of World War I, a youngish Hungarian-born bourgeois Jew, Theodor Herzl, had established the Zionist movement. Herzl believed the Gentile, that is, non-Jewish society, was inevitably anti-Semitic, and that the answer was for Jews to create their own homeland. In practice, that meant that all Jews, capitalists, small business people, and workers alike were united. Today, Zionists claim Israel-Palestine is theirs based on the Word of God. But at one point, Herzl considered the idea of a Jewish homeland in South America. Ultimately, he settled on Palestine as the Jewish homeland, but more specifically, a homeland for European Jews. Originally, the Jewish homeland was conceived as being under Ottoman rule, and then, after World War I, under British rule. In the 1917 Balfour Declaration, the British imperialists declared Palestine as a Jewish homeland in the political sense. British imperialism saw an increased Jewish population in Palestine as being a population base through which they could rule, just like they used or got some support from the Protestants in Ulster and Northern Ireland to rule in Ireland. In fact, the first British military governor of Palestine, Sir Ronald Storrs, put it very clearly. He saw the potential for a growing Jewish population in Palestine to be, quote, "our loyal little Jewish Ulster," end quote. Now, another wing of Zionism, other than that led by Herzl, that developed in the post-World War I era, was Zionist revisionism, led by Vladimir Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky called for an independent Jewish state in Palestine. He ended up as an outright fascist whose supporters paraded around in Nazi-like brown shirt uniforms. And he was quite clear. Jabotinsky wrote that, quote, "Zionism is a colonizing adventure and therefore it stands or falls by the question of armed force," end quote. During the Russian Civil War following the 1917 revolution, Jabotinsky offered to collaborate with the Ukrainian counter-revolutionary general Simon Petlura of Cossack heritage. Jabotinsky offered his forces to patrol any Jewish regions that Petlura's army conquered. Petlura's army had led anti-Jewish pogroms in Ukraine that slaughtered some 30,000 Jews from 1917 to 1920. About 60,000 Jews were killed in pogroms in Ukraine during those years overall. Jabotinsky's offer to collaborate with Petlura created such a scandal within the World Zionist Organization that Jabotinsky actually withdrew from it rather than be investigated. We will see where his so-called Zionist revisionism forces led in a later period. Jabotinsky's traitorous role towards the Ukrainian Jews was not unique in Zionism, but today he was highly revered as a figure in Israel. Now let us skip here to the situation for the Jewish people between World War I and World War II. At that time, the Jews were scattered throughout Europe, America, and Southwest Asia and North Africa, with the majority being in Eastern Europe, especially Poland and Russia. The Jews did not live in one contiguous landmass. They spoke different languages, ate different foods, and in essence had different cultures. In other words, the Jews were not a people nation in the same sense that the Kurds or the Uyghurs are today. As far as Palestine being their so-called homeland, any Jews who were not living within Palestine had their links with that part of the world broken thousands of years earlier. Therefore, the Zionist project did not correspond to the material conditions of Europe's Jews, and as a result, Zionism was just a fringe movement among those Jews. As with all other peoples, the Jews were divided by class. The working class majority followed another political tendency, social democracy. It was the Jewish Bund, a Jewish social democratic party that the majority of Europe's Jews supported. As social democrats, the Bund had a class-based analysis. They saw society as basically divided up between capitalists and workers, whereas Zionists saw all Jews, workers and capitalists alike, as being united. And in every single nationalist movement that seeks to unite workers and capitalists, the capitalists dominate and control the movement. That is exactly what's happened with Zionism. Now, let's turn to what was happening in Palestine in those early years. It's important to stress that there had been Jews in all of the region long before Zionism arose, and contrary to what we've been told, there were no major conflicts between the Jews and the Arabs during that whole period. Also, at that time, the particular experiences that molded the Arab majority into Palestinians was just beginning, so they themselves referred to themselves as Arabs rather than Palestinians. In Palestine, the Arab majority was called Fellahin, rural small farmers, who either worked their own small plots of land or worked for a large landowner. The issue of Jewish settlers steadily encroaching on the Arab land was a huge issue. However, for reasons of time, I won't be able to deal with that issue. Instead, I'm going to focus on developments within the working class, amongst wage workers. That's because I believe that under capitalism, it is the working class that is the key force for change. And that was reflected in the fact that a dominant Zionist force in Palestine was so-called labor Zionism, as we will see. In Palestine under British rule, the Zionist project faced a problem because to have a Jewish homeland settled by Jews from Europe, and Zionism was a European-based project, it must attract Jewish workers from Europe. And to attract those Jewish workers, it was necessary for them to have a standard of living that was above what workers in the Arab world had at that time. But no capitalist, British, Arab, Jewish, or anybody else, is going to offer pay above what they have to. And the extremely low wages that they could get away with paying Arab workers served to drag down the pay of Jewish workers also, which meant it was nearly impossible to attract Jewish workers from Europe. So the Zionists had two different strategies to deal with that. One was to establish what amounted to two different economies, one low value and low pay economy for the Arab workers, and a higher value and higher pay economy for Jewish workers. That was a form of economic apartheid. The other strategy was at times to help Arab workers raise their pay in order to raise the floor for all workers, Jewish and Arab alike. For this, some form of unionism was needed, and that was the basis for what was known as labor Zionism. But the very term labor Zionism is inherently contradictory. That's because the labor movement necessarily means uniting all of labor, all workers, regardless of race, gender, nationality, etc. While on the other hand, Zionism was an explicitly Jewish project aimed at building a Jewish homeland at the expense of non-Jews, meaning Arabs. In the workplace, it meant building a Jewish workforce that often necessarily involved replacing Arab workers with Jewish workers. So, it was impossible for Zionists to build a real labor movement, to build real unionism. And that was the contradiction that labor Zionism represented. It was an absolutely essential ingredient to the Zionist project, which absolutely had to betray real worker solidarity. Backed by the British imperialists, the labor Zionists had a lot of influence and power with the Jews coming from Europe. In 1920, the labor Zionists held the founding conference of the Histadrut. The Histadrut was a so-called union federation, basically an alliance of various workers' unions. The Histadrut's full name was the General Organization of Hebrew Workers in the Land of Israel, and they meant Hebrew workers exclusively. There were struggles around Arab exclusion, but it was not until 1959 that the Histadrut accepted Arab, which is to say Palestinian workers, as full members. In other words, the Histadrut literally was a form of apartheid or Jim Crow unionism, which means it wasn't really unionism at all. At times, the Histadrut did organize Arab workers, but as we will see, they always did so under the control of the European Jewish supremacist Histadrut leadership. As a result of the role of labor Zionism, to this very day, the Israeli working class has a very weak tradition of genuine unionism and solidarity between Jewish and Palestinian workers. This helps explain in part the enormous divide between today's Palestinian and Jewish workers and the low level of class consciousness. David Ben-Gurion, who was Israel's first prime minister and was labor Zionism personified, said that the creation of a labor front was, quote, the mission of the Jewish workers, end quote, not the common task of both groups, just the Jewish workers. Let's take a second to absorb this quote from Ben-Gurion, which shows what labor Zionism really meant. The Histadrut did at times organize Arab workers to struggle for better pay, but what they did not do, and what they always opposed, was the self-organizing of the Arab workers themselves. While labor Zionist leaders saw raising the wages of the Arab workers as being in the interest of the Zionist project, they also saw all Arab organizing as a threat to the Zionist project. In part, Arab self-organizing was a threat because it went against the Histadrut's organized effort to replace Arab workers with Jewish workers. Also, in part, it was a threat because it risked fomenting Arab nationalism, which Zionism opposed. The Histadrut also operated as a capitalist employment agency. It was directly involved in setting up some of the kibbutzim, or farms. These were farms owned by the Jewish Agency, a capitalist entity formerly known as the World Zionist Congress. The Histadrut also set up a Jewish construction employment agency to hire Jewish construction workers in the building of a deep water port in Haifa. Now, not all Jewish workers were totally and hopelessly racist. There were a couple of political parties that expressed a drive for unity, but both of these parties tried to square the circle. They tried to align Zionism, the creation of a specifically Jewish homeland, with working class unity. The only working class party in Palestine that unequivocally rejected Zionism and tried to help Arab workers organize was the Palestine Communist Party, which belonged to the Third International. The Palestine Communist Party, in part, owed its existence to the revolutionary wave that swept the world working class, following the 1917 Russian Revolution. But the Palestine Communist Party had to swim against every single other political tendency in Palestine. And also, by the early 1920s, that revolutionary wave, which followed the Russian Revolution, was receding, and in my opinion, this also weakened the Palestine Communist Party. So now, as I begin to wrap up, let's look at how these dynamics played out in the railway industry, which was very important in Palestine. At that time, the Histadrut founded the Railway Workers Association, a railway union, in 1919. Although this union belonged to the Histadrut, it also directly recruited Arab railway workers as full members, and therein lay the contradiction. the Arab workers reacted to the fact that the Histadrut, the parent body, only accepted Jewish members. So while some Arab railway workers did join the union, the apartheid position of the Histadrut was a barrier to major recruitment into the railway union. In the 1920s, there was a struggle within the Railway Workers Association for it to leave the Histadrut. Only the Palestine Communist Party advocated that position. This was an uphill battle, partly because the Histadrut played a major role in financing the Railway Workers Union. The Histadrut leadership ultimately expelled the communists and then got them fired from the railways. For obvious reasons, the Arab railway workers distrusted the labor Zionist leadership of the union. As a result, they then came under the influence of Arab middle-class nationalists and formed a railroad workers union exclusively for Arab workers, the Palestine Arab Workers Society, or PAWS, P-A-W-S. Ultimately, this proved to be no solution either. In order to counter the PAWS, the Histadrut set up an organizing effort for Arab workers called the Palestine Labor League and the PLL, and through the PLL, they partly succeeded in undermining any organizing of Palestinian workers outside of their sphere of influence, the Histadrut sphere of influence, such as the Palestine Arab Workers Society, which was under the influence of the middle-class nationalists. During this entire period, there were efforts at class solidarity by Jewish workers in one place after another, for example, among Haifa Jewish port workers, but without a central organization. These efforts were defeated time and again by the Histadrut, and even if they had had a central leadership, the balance of forces by that time was against them. One final example of the racist role of labor Zionism and the Histadrut in decimating the working class consciousness in Palestine is that of the construction and then operation of the Nesher cement plant, which still exists to this day. The plant was constructed from 1922 to 24. The Histadrut succeeded in getting the construction crew to be all Jewish. When the plant opened in 1925, they employed only Jewish workers, but the quarry that supplied raw material employed both Jewish and Egyptian Arab workers. The Histadrut tried and ultimately succeeded in getting that crew to be all Jewish, getting the Arab workers to be fired. Now here, global counter-revolution played a decisive role in Zionism taking a hold. In February of 1932, Hitler came to power in Germany. This resulted in a massive increase of Jewish immigration into Palestine. In 1931, 4,000 Jews immigrated into Palestine. In 1935 alone, that number swelled to 62,000 Jewish immigrants. There followed an economic boom in Palestine. The Histadrut campaigned for the replacement of Arab workers at the ports, in agriculture, and in construction. In all those industries, those campaigns included picketing work sites and even physical assaults on Arab workers. The legacies of labor Zionism, and the Histadrut in particular, are nothing but European Jewish supremacist apartheid and intentional misuse of the term labor and unionism. In conclusion, to sum up and stress my main points once again. 1. The Jewish people were not a national minority, and consequently Zionism never had a mass base among European Jews prior to the rise of Hitler. Second, in placing Jewish workers under the control of Jewish capitalists, Zionism always was a reactionary and pro-imperialist movement. Third, Zionism both represented and relied upon British imperialism in this period. Fourth, in Palestine, Zionism completely perverted and undermined any true working class solidarity. And fifth, in doing so, Zionism created deep divisions between the Arab and Jewish working class, and this devastated class consciousness at that time and continues to do so to this very day.